a model that I took from theatre was, if you see a powerful king on a stage, what makes them powerful is not the size of their crown, the size of their throne, nothing like that. That just makes them a king. What makes them a powerful king is everyone else on the stage bowing down before them. And that is the power that they exercise over the people who are bowing down. What then might happen on stage, if you want to dramatize the loss of power, one person who was kneeling down sits up, turns their back on the king.
I'm Ran Dror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Jean-Paul Flintoff. Jean-Paul is a writer, performer, and illustrator, and the author of books like How to Change the World and a modest book about how to make an adequate speech. He worked for 15 years as a writer and associate editor on the Financial Times, the Sunday Times, and other papers and magazines, and has been involved with the School of Life in London as a lecturer and writer. Today, he runs a subscription service called Adequate Project, which provides moral support and a bit of financial freedom in return for discounts and exclusive access. We spoke in early June 2022, and I was excited to talk to Jean-Paul because of his involvement with so many things I care about, from the School of Life to mindful use of technology to improv and creativity to the art of writing. I really enjoyed talking to Jean-Paul, and we covered many topics like the importance of creativity and how he learned it as a child, his attraction to poetry and why he became a journalist, his book, How to Change the World, and the burden it placed on him later in life, his involvement with the School of Life, what learning improv taught him about creativity and about life, his work on public speaking and his book on the subject, and how tragedy reshaped his life and led him on a search for more resilient happiness. I left this conversation feeling inspired by Jean-Paul's honesty, his never-ending search for expression, creativity, and happiness, and the wisdom with which he connects with the people around him. I think most of our listeners will feel the same. This conversation is one of many weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, and entrepreneurs who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now, let's jump right in with Jean-Paul Flintoff. All right, I'm sitting here with Jean-Paul Flintoff. Jean-Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here.
So usually these days we start with a question about the world and how and where it finds us. We went through COVID and, we're still in the midst of a war in Europe. So my opening question these days is, what's it like to be you in the world today?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. To be me in the world today is to be someone who right now is looking back 10 years to a very different kind of anniversary in this country where I live, in England, in the UK. And it was an anniversary which is public because the Queen had her Jubilee, and we're now this weekend celebrating another one, 10 years on. And it's very much in my head that these very particular other things were happening 10 years ago. And I think there's also, to be perfectly honest, a slightly mournful quality because it's probably unlikely that there'll be another in 10 years, but I would be really delighted to know what you call a Jubilee 10 years after a Platinum Jubilee.
Maybe a diamond?
No, she's had the diamond, I think.
Oh,
she's had
okay.
Gold and diamond, so maybe titanium or something, uranium.
Yeah. We have to invent some futuristic metal that doesn't exist currently.
Yes.
And so I know you're very involved with technology and using the right tools in the right way and crafting the right sort of life. And I'm guessing you have something to say about that in the context of COVID, in the context of isolation, and how that affected your use. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts around that and what's new
Yes.
in that area.
A couple of the things, I just happened to be talking this afternoon to someone about one of the ways in which technology seems to have had an overall effect on human interconnection as a result of so many people using platforms like this one that we're talking on now. It seems to be the case to me that, and this is an unwelcome development, it seems to me that more and more people think you have to schedule a time to talk to someone about anything. And someone reminded me the other day that I don't have to schedule a time to phone him. And the fact that he even felt that it was necessary to remind me of that is quite telling, because I didn't think I was a bad case of this. So one thing that it's done is it's made it so much easier for people to pop into my life, whether it's through a mutual platform like this where I can see you, you can talk to me, I can talk to you, or a sort of one-way broadcasting thing. You turn on my phone and Twitter puts something into my world that I didn't expect. And so it can be quite porous. And that can be a good thing, but it could also be quite overwhelming. Well, I have turned on Twitter and thought, oh my goodness, I didn't want to read that straight away. Something dismal, something distressing about the world. So I think I'm really conscious of, at the moment, my own attempts to use older technologies, and they are technologies, they're not nothing, but using paper is really important to me. Actually, one of the things I've done quite a lot, quite consciously in 2022 is handwrite letters to people, which I send in the post. And they're so surprised and really pleased. Just the envelope alone is already a big win.
Yeah. I can imagine getting something in the mail like that, and that would be, it would feel extra special. Whereas we kind of hate email, don't we? You're never happy to receive I'm very rarely happy to receive an email. But if someone took the trouble to write it, I would probably be very happy. So we both have a love of paper. And for many years, the paper notebook, the Moleskine notebook, or some sort of high quality notebook was so important to me. I recently became a trader to paper by buying a Remarkable tablet, which is an e-ink tablet paper that works quite well. I don't know if you've seen those.
I have seen them. I'd love to know how have you experienced it?
So for a couple of years now, because I got it a couple of years ago, did not feel the need to carry a paper pad with me, which I used to always do. It works beautifully. I forget that it's not paper. You can touch it. You can rest your palm on it and then write. It works very well for the sensation. I do still feel for things that are emotionally important. So for instance, I have a meditation journal. And for that, I actually have a paper notebook. But for everything else, for thinking on paper, for writing throughout the day, I have multiple notebooks on it, and it works quite well.
Yeah, that's very interesting and tempting because, I mean, I do use my iPad for drawing. I don't use it for writing in that way. But there's something about using the iPad to draw that feels boundless and endlessly repeatable and reshapeable. But I also draw on paper and then do digital tweaks and, for example, just do a line drawing and then color it with digital. However, when it comes to written things, I'm increasingly convinced that what I actually want is something to flick through again. And I can't do that digitally. I can't ever really flick through stuff.
Yeah, it's a really tough thing because I think digital, as a product designer, I think digital is eventually going to be in a place where it's indistinguishable. So you can have the full sensual experience of writing. But until we're there, we're now in transition. Until we're there, we kind of have to choose between the sensual pleasures of writing with paper and seeing the ink spill and the unique shape it makes, and the unlimited nature of digital, where you can easily erase and redo and undo and save infinite notebooks. I think everybody finds their own place in that, navigating that space.
There's something delightfully enriching for me about the combination, actually. Let me just turn my screen around. You can see here some drawings that I did recently, and most of them are line drawings that I then digitally colored. I know that the really sophisticated techniques on Procreate on my iPad can reproduce a pen that's running out of ink or whatever it may be. But there's something about the combination that makes those pictures the ones I love most.
So we usually like to start our exploration with a biographical question that helps us connect the person to what they're doing today. And so our listeners will know this question, which is, what's something you've learned in childhood or early in life that still drives you today or guides you today?
I think it comes to the drawing, actually. I think that I learned in childhood that when I was in some kind of a pickle, I hope that word means something to you, like it's something troubling in some way. If I picked up a pen and allowed myself to have that tiny bit of agency in the physical universe, it was very soothing. It was very low pressure. And it led to something. And that's an enormous source of pleasure and discovery. So I'm not sure if it's guiding or if it's pulling or if it's pushing or what kind of guidance that is. But the act of sitting down or standing, because I do it in the street in a notebook, and just letting the pen do that kind of making a line with a pen thing is a huge relief to me.
And how did you come to associate drawing with that relief? Can you take me back?
Yeah. The times that I'm thinking of, so I don't know how often this happened, but the times that I'm thinking of, I felt somehow cornered or stuck. And I might feel physically in a room at a table or in a corner of a chair or something. I might feel physically stuck. And the way out of that immobilized sense was almost invisible, because to all onlookers, I'm not doing anything. But actually, my left hand is moving very slightly, and a whole new world is opening up on my lap or at the table. I rediscovered the importance of drawing to myself when my daughter was little. In fact, it was before she drew, because I was starting to draw her from the moment she was born. And I think there's something in that connection, the sense that here is one thing that I've partly created, and here is a thing I'm creating around it and of it, her. So I drew a heck of a lot when she was little.
You told the story of being in a quite a tough school as a kid. And despite that was a place that really had a lot of encouragement to be creative. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I went to a school which was in a borough in central London, where it was the only state school. So it was, as it were, by definition, a sink school, because the people who couldn't go anywhere else all ended up there. And then there were a certain number of people whose parents were particularly idealistic about state schools. My parents were probably among the latter. I never knew how to say, I don't like it here, but I was scared a lot of the time. There was a lot of physical violence, and that was not good. However, one of the things about the school that was tremendous was that the idealism among the teachers took the form of encouraging people's self-expression. And we were really well stocked with music department, art department, the languages, particularly English literature, and I've probably forgotten something, drama. I did all of those things. I found it enormously enriching, and again, something of a relief, that sense of relief. And I think we have talked at some point, and maybe we will talk about impro and theatrical impro, and the sort of freedom that comes from that moment of being absolutely in creativity. That to me is what freedom is. So I'm permanently grateful to my school for that. I saw I was going to say my old English teacher, and in probably every sense, he is now my old English teacher. And it was great to see him, and I owe him so much in the way that I suspect is very common. He doesn't realize how much, even if I tell him, it doesn't sink home quite what a profound effect we can have on others without knowing.
Yeah. I've had similar experiences. I met an old teacher of mine that I really worship, and in an event, and he was surrounded by his new students from this year who are less than half my age. And of course he was, right? Of course that was his priority at that moment. I ended up sitting quietly in the side and, in this event, and not really getting to demand attention. So after this, this time at school and this creative time, and I know you were writing poetry and you were drawing and making art, you ended up becoming a journalist. So what was that turn like?
It was interesting because I really loved English literature. I loved a fairly old-fashioned approach to it. So the canon of dead white males and some others. But I did like that experience of studying these classic poets and dramatists. And then I left university with a master's degree, and I'd written half of my thesis in rhyming couplets, as if it had been written by Alexander Pope. Too complicated to explain, but anyway, and it went down quite well, and I was very happy with that. But so I left university wanting to be a poet. I thought, well, I've studied Andrew Marvell and John Milton and John Donne, and these guys were poets, so I'll be a poet. And after about 3 days, it occurred to me that I'm never going to make a living. So what the closest I could do to make a living from writing, and you can't just very quickly crank out a book. So journalism was the obvious, fairly quick way of being paid. And one thing led to another, and I was invited to take a job that I didn't like the sound of, but it turned out to be really interesting. And I then got promoted and moved on. And then I did publish a book, which was a memoir of the school that I just mentioned to you. And there's a strange thing that seems to happen in the world, that if you publish a book and it's not utterly obscure, people think you must be okay. And I got hired by the Financial Times to be the staff writer on the magazine there, which was just such an amazing blessing. And I knew it was at the time. I had really wide range of writing assignments, basically almost anything that I wanted. And I had plenty of time to write them. And it was just amazing, just brilliant. And I learned so much about the techniques of writing. So keeping in mind your focus on design, there are design principles in writing a magazine story, and also in disguising them. Nobody wants to read a magazine story that has obvious scaffolding and architecture. So that I found really appealed to me, this sense of the how is this done. I've always been interested in the how is this done. How do you achieve that? So at the small level within a sentence, how do I achieve that effect of making someone laugh, or sadness, or changing someone's mind about something? And at the overall scale, how do I encourage someone to read a magazine story, which, let's be honest, nobody really has to do. Nobody desperately needs to read a magazine story. So there are certain conjuring tricks that I picked up along the way to engage people, to keep their attention, to pique their curiosity. I found that enormously enriching and exciting. And of course, I met lots of interesting people. So that was the most unexpected blessing of being a journalist.
So can you give some examples of memorable meetings that changed you?
Gosh, that's such a good question. And there are so many, But I'll try to give a reasonable variety. So one of the things I learned quite quickly was that interviewing very famous people is broadly going to be quite boring because they've answered most of the questions that I'm really being sent along to ask. I could ask them about something obscure and I might be really interested and they might be really interested to answer, but my editor doesn't want that stuff. So I got very excited about interviewing people who are not very well known because they're the reality of their situation and the excitement of their intellectual ideas is really vivid and really easily brought out of them. I don't mean always easily, because sometimes I'd be interviewing people about things that are very raw and painful, and those were the opposite of easy to pull out of them. I think probably the story that is most fun about going out in the world and meeting people is about a concert, which I think was called Live 8. It was a big global series of concerts. There was one in London, there were others in New York and so on. It was masterminded, I think, by Al Gore. I should remember this. But anyway, there were tons of celebrities. And for cunning marketing reasons, the publicity people who hosted it gave the Sunday Times one artist's pass that was going to be taken away if anyone recognized that this person was a journalist. And I was the one given the pass. So I was in the artist's enclosure. And at one very extraordinary moment before the event started, I was surrounded by Bill Gates, Madonna, Elton John, Snoop Dogg, just so many more, Kofi Annan, Chris Martin and Gwyneth Paltrow and their little baby. They were all within an arm's reach of me. It was sort of the most extraordinary crush of famous people. And so that was interesting in its own way because I was backstage and I had this artist pass, and I guess they all looked at me and thought, I don't know who this guy is, but he must be the bass player in the least well-known band. But what made it particularly exquisitely exciting was that I had to not be discovered as a journalist. And I had also the technical problem of having to write by 4 p.m., and this is an event that finished at 10 p.m., I had to write at 4 p.m. the first version of the story that would appear tomorrow morning. So I didn't know what was going to happen in the next 6 hours, and I still had to write 1,600 words without being identifiably a journalist. So I spent a lot of time in the very upmarket toilets, which Snoop Dogg complained about. Apparently they weren't upmarket enough for him.
Being around celebrities is such a strange thing because I've lived in New York for about a decade. So I had my share of encounters with Liam Neeson in the coffee shop or Al Pacino in the coffee shop. I thought that I would be normal. The closer the encounter, the stranger it felt. Like, that we had, I was in this conference where Joseph Gordon-Levitt sat right next to me around the fireplace.
Right.
And I was just like, I can't talk to him. I'm like, everything that I'll say just sounds fake to me. Like I'm just going to ignore him. And I ignored him the whole night because I couldn't find like a normal tone of voice because I've watched his movies and, watching him on TV and it's a strange experience. So I want to move on to your book, How to Change the World. But first, maybe help me understand how you go from being a journalist to being an author and what was that process like?
Great, thank you. So the first book I wrote, it was about my school and it was a memoir and it was meant to be funny and it was also meant to shine a light on these rather rough inner London schools. So then I went to become a magazine writer. So I was kind of was an author already, but I didn't do any authoring in all the time that I was working for the FT and then the Sunday Times of London. The reason why I then became interested in this change-making stuff is because in the early years of this century, I found something that I'd never come across before that seemed absolutely enormously important. And I thought, why has no one written about this? And I looked it up on, you can get databases that show when certain words have been used in newspapers. Nobody had written anything about this thing called peak oil. And it proposed, for those who don't know already, that there is a finite amount of oil and on this planet, which must be the case because it is finite. And it also proposed that we will never get all the oil out of the ground because some of the oil will take more than a barrel of oil to extract a barrel. So we're bound to leave some of that stuff because it's too expensive. It will never pay its own way. So at some point, we'll get to the point where we've extracted as much as we can. And what do we do then? And I was really excited about this. And I phoned my editor and told her all about it. And as I was explaining the story, the words turned to ash in my mouth. I thought, this is really terrible. This is really bleak. And what this is going to do to prices, and because everything, including food, depends on fossil fuels, this is really, really bleak. And I think I got really depressed. And I hung out with lots of people in vaguely environmental movements who were probably also really depressed. I got even more depressed. And I was trying desperately to think, how do I find a way to tell the story of this that doesn't just put everyone off before they've even started listening? So I thought the best thing I could do is to write something that's sort of cheerfully about my own adventures to do something about it, and then smuggle into the story little insights into this being potentially a problem. So that's what I did. And because this was around about 2007 now, there was a big flurry of interest in the environment, and everyone seemed to be publishing newspaper stories about having their own vegetable plot. I didn't want to do that. So I thought the other thing that we do with plants is make clothes. And because I am and was a man of my age, which was then in my 40s, it seemed to me it was quite amusing for a man to make all his own clothes. And not just to make them, but to actually grow the nettles from which I would spin the yarn, with which I would crochet to make my own underpants. And I thought that would be funny. A man who wears jockey shorts made out of nettle is quite funny. And everyone always says, do they sting? No, they don't sting, because once you've extracted the fiber, they don't sting. But anyway, it's an arresting thought. And I thought that will get people in. And I presented it as a kind of knockabout, jokey version of a death set, the sort of thing that warns us of what we are facing. So whereas in the Renaissance, they would put a skull on their desk to say, come on, get writing because you're going to be dead one day. I made my nettle underpants as a way of saying, watch out. If we don't do this right, we'll all be wearing nettle underpants. That was the kind of the conceit. And it was a first-person story, and it was meant to be funny and engaging, and I got invited to do talks about it. And then I did those talks at a place called the School of Life, and then they invited me to do more, and I became a sort of adjunct member of their faculty, and I did lots and lots of things. And one day they said, would you write a book called How to Change the World? No, would you write a book? That's what they said. We're doing a series of books. Would you like to write one? And of course, I'm a writer. I said, yes. And Caroline Brimmer said, what would it be? And I was only joking, but I said, I'll write How to Change the World. And she looked like that was a great idea. So I suddenly backtracked on the jokiness and thought, I'll do that. Yeah, and I'll really do that. So whereas the first one was in some ways the same book, but it was much more a shaggy dog tale of one person's attempt. The second one was a program, a guide to how anyone can try to think about making their own world different in the way they want to do.
Before we get into the contents of the book, I'm a huge fan of the School of Life, and I've been following Alain de Botton for years. And so tell me about the School of Life. So I think some people might not know it. Yeah. What makes it special? What is it about? And what was it like to work there?
Great. Yeah, I will. So when I first turned up, I hadn't heard of it before, and I made the mistake of saying so. I went along and I did a talk about my book, and it evidently had very warm response. And they said, would you come back and do some more? Would you do some classes on something like it? Maybe you could open it out and call it something like How to Make a Difference. And so I created that class. And the School of Life was at that time just a bookshop with a bit of a kind of coffee shop down kind of feel. It was never a coffee shop. And downstairs there was a room that was beautifully illustrated. Every wall had line drawings on it of, as it were, the interior of a very interesting house. And there was a whiteboard that doubled as a screen, and we would show a few slides in the course of a talk or a class. And I ran those classes. I ran the class on religion for atheists. We didn't call it that. It was how to fill the God-shaped hole was what we called it when it was a class. I ran a number of the different classes. There would be typically about 30 or so people, sometimes fewer. how to think about death didn't tend to attract an enormous crowd, but it was a really interesting and rich class. A huge number of different classes. It was actually exactly 10 years ago, this month that's just finished, that we published those books. There were 6 of us. We didn't know each other beforehand. And then we went off on a little kind of nerdy writers rock and roll tour around the country and outside the country, doing these sort of 15-minute TED-style talks about our books and getting to know each other. It was really lovely to have that sort of bonding of 6 authors together. You don't normally have that.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. Yeah. And that's actually one of the church-shaped holes in secular culture that Alon identifies, right? Is that there's no organization to support intellectuals. And we're all doing, work on our own and with no support network. It's very lovely that there was something like that.
To feel that you belong to a place where you're allowed to talk about these things that really matter to you is a huge gift.
You talk about how to change the world, and you say change, not save the world. What's the distinction that you're making there?
I'm so glad you point that out, because people have introduced me as someone who says, I'm coming to save the world. I don't even know what you want to save the world from. Like, so save the world not only sounds dangerously messianic and self-important, but change the world is so much more modular and adjustable to different people with different causes. It's a sort of some satisfaction to me, not overwhelming satisfaction, but some satisfaction that people who have very different ideas about what's appropriate could find useful advice in my book. I don't want to say, this is what I want you to do, this is how you must do it. I want to say, these are some ways of thinking about how change might be affected. And I don't know your world, I don't know your life, or what's problematic, or what's delightful. But I would like you to be able to identify those things, and like you to have a chance to bend the world a bit more in that direction.
You spend a good chunk of the book overcoming defeatism, or, giving us the hope that it could be done. So what would you say to someone who is a little bit cynical or a little bit hopeless?
What I did say a lot, because I was asked to talk about this a lot, because it's an obviously appealing title for a talk. And I would this happened by accident. Nearly always, I would start the talk in the way that it happened by accident, which was to say, if you had the chance, would you change the world? And I'd let the question hang there, and nobody would answer, because they didn't think I was really asking. But I was. And so then I'd say, oh dear, that's not very good. And so then I'd say, I'll ask you again, if you had the chance, would you change the world? And they'd all go, yes. So what I actually invited people to do was to identify that they would. So that alone is part of the movement to overcome the defeatism, is to allow people to notice that there is actually a real invitation here. So that's the first thing. And the next thing that I would often say is that we all recognize that in any kind of an election, you can vote for these people or those people, or not vote for any of them because you hate them all. But whatever you do, it has some impact on the outcome, for sure. Because if you'd done a slightly different thing, then the whole election might have gone differently. So when people acknowledge that that is indeed the case, that every tiny little contribution or non-contribution is effective, then I get to point out that even by going to bed at night, you're having an effect, because you could be out on the street feeding the homeless or whatever. I'm not saying that we should do that, because that would be exhausting and then you'd be no good to anyone. But to take responsibility for what you are and are not doing, just profoundly and radically to take responsibility, and not to beat yourself up for it, but just say, yeah, no, that's true. I do have some responsibility here. And what's really wonderful is that going with that, you have the let out of not having total responsibility. Of course you don't. None of us can single-handedly do this. So then it becomes a communication question. How can you invite and encourage others to join in your thing? And can you be okay with it if, after trying that for a while, it just becomes clear that it's not a thing for other people? Maybe it's not a good idea at all. How can you live with that? How can you either adjust it, the pivot thing that entrepreneurs all talk about, or you actually say, no, that's not a thing. I'm just going to let it go.
You talk about change in small and local ways, like just smiling at someone as you pass them by or as you meet them at the coffee shop, right? And you talk about adding beauty and fun. Talk more about that. What does it mean to add beauty and fun?
I'm glad you mentioned about the smiling thing, because that was in my mind, because not that long before I'd done some travel journalism in Ukraine and in Kiev. I was really struck by how little eye contact I received at the time. This was before sort of velvet orange revolutions and things. This was just not a happy place. People were wary and suspicious of each other. And as an outsider coming in briefly and then going away again, it really struck me that people were not giving eye contact, let alone smiling. And I thought, there's no harm. If I smile at someone without it being forced, I'm not trying to manipulate them, I'm not trying to sell them something, I'm just smiling like, hello, I'm a human and you're a human. And we don't have to engage in any greater way than that. And you don't have to smile back either, that's fine. What would that be like? And I just thought that's an important one, because it also, when I was trying to think, how do I write a book on how to change the world and not be grandiose and not be ridiculously overambitious either? People who don't believe they can have an impact on the world might want to experiment with the most tiny little things. And maybe the fact that you can smile at someone and maybe get a smile back, maybe, no promise, but maybe you can get a smile back. Maybe by doing that, you'll brighten up their day. Maybe you'll brighten up your day. If you feel like it, I'm not coercing everyone to smile when they're feeling really miserable. So there's just little tiny experiments in noticing one's own agency and the limits of one's agency. But you can't feel the agency unless you know what the limits are. You'll never do anything. You'll just stay in your house because you don't want to go out in case nobody smiles back. You got to get out there and try smiling.
Yeah, and it's amazing, I think, how much impact you make just by having the right attitude and being nice. One funny thing that happened a few years ago, started meditating, and I guess I was in a better mood, so I was walking around with a smile on my face. And I noticed that I started getting a lot of free food in restaurants, and like wherever I went, like servers especially appreciated that, right? Because they probably have a lot of unpleasant encounters where they're not seen, or just from that, the reflection of that, where I started getting free food and free stuff. And I was like, oh, I guess that it does mean something.
That's terrific data, isn't it?
Yeah. One time a server thanked me and I couldn't figure out what I did. I was like, what did I do? And they were like, thank you. But I think I just asked them how they were with like intention.
Yeah, makes all the difference, doesn't it?
I think if you're working long days in a service job, that could make a better day.
Definitely. No, I really passionately, those words you used, with intention, I passionately believe that's the most important thing that we can do in life, is to really be real human beings with real human beings, and not to just skip past it. Even fleeting. It's not about saying you've got to have a long chat with everyone who ever serves you anything in a cafe. No, not at all. But let your hello be real.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a big difference. So there's these little things, but you also quote Gene Sharp, who dealt with big changes, right? You wrote a book about nonviolent protest and actually created a catalog of these things. So what are some of the tools that we can use for change that are actually effective?
Great. Yes. So Gene Sharp is no longer, he died fairly recently. He was pretty elderly, and I went to interview him, and he had slaved away for a very long time collecting data about political change that had not involved violence. So he told me he's not a pacifist, he's not against violence per se, but he thought it would be interesting and useful to really understand what has worked. And essentially what it came down to was the insight that nobody has power over you unless you give them that power. And a model that I took from theatre was, if you see a powerful king on a stage, what makes them powerful is not the size of their crown, the size of their throne, nothing like that. That just makes them a king. What makes them a powerful king is everyone else on the stage bowing down before them. And that is the power that they exercise over the people who are bowing down. What then might happen on stage, if you want to dramatize the loss of power, one person who was kneeling down sits up, turns their back on the king. For the audience, that's going to be really powerful to see, because it's like, wow, the king's lost power. How did that happen? Just by one person deciding. And essentially that's what we see when we see big protests in cities. That's people turning their back on the powerful king, a form of saying no. And what Gene Sharp took from that insight was that there are different ways in which we can say no. And one of the ways is to stop having anything to do with the thing that we don't like. Another way is to draw attention to the things that we would like instead. And so he collected from all over the world and from all sorts of kinds of history and from biblical history and from chronological history, examples of types of protest. And one of my favorites is Exodus, which, as the Bible has it, it's very hard for Pharaoh to be unkind if you've got out of there. So Exodus, by getting out of there, you can't be messed around by the powerful king, if that makes sense. And Exodus is, of course, something that people still use there when they flee their country to go and live somewhere else. That's a form of Exodus. So these are stories or facts or whatever you call them that give inspiration for a shape that protest might take. Some of them, I think, are misused because protest groups fall in love with the idea of, oh, we'll do a mock funeral or something. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a mock funeral. That could be great, but it may not be the perfect thing for your context. So what you want to do is think about, how will this really play out? Who will like this? Who will be inspired by it? Will we be preaching to the choir? Will we actually reach people who don't normally see this stuff? So, for example, a lot of environmental protest is done by people who dress in kind of out there, a bit left field, colourful clothes and sandals. I love those people. I have nothing against that. But maybe it would be really remarkable if they all did it wearing suits. I don't know, sometimes. So just thinking about, who is your audience? Who are you trying to affect? And then thinking about the different ways in which you can do things. And Gene Sharp collected, partly as a function of when he was doing this work, lots of data relating to Nazi occupation of Europe and beyond. So some of the things that he showed are forms of dissent, which were quite oblique. One of the ones that I really love is the so-called Guten Tag Doctor in Germany. And you knew that they were more likely to sign you off as being unfit for military service because instead of saying Heil Hitler when you walked in to see them, they said Guten Tag. Just by changing the way in which you welcome someone into your doctor's room, you're giving a little signal. And I think that's so beautiful because it's so small and granular. And it's very polite, say Guten Tag is a perfectly nice thing to say. And it's a tiny little symbol of what might happen next and how you could do something else. The thing that we're seeing at the moment with lots of countries renaming the street in which the Russian embassy finds itself, renaming it something like Ukraine Forever, that was used in Poland by some people who changed the names of streets to things like Roosevelt Avenue, just to annoy the Nazis. So I like the fact that these things have a kind of a heritage and we can borrow from them and we can take out the library of Gene Sharp's acts of nonviolent resistance. And, oh yeah, I think I'll do that one today.
Yeah, and he had in the scale there's some interventions that actually stop normal business as usual, that have a stopping power, just like a violent revolution would.
Yeah, and the tech version of that, I think, is it called VDOS?
Yeah.
Where you just crash someone's servers, but everybody just crashes the servers. And it's a kind of overwhelmed the system.
Distributed denial of service attack,
That's it, yeah.
So, I mean, it prevents you from being able to get to a website because you're actually hitting it too much, right?
Yeah.
So That's really lovely. I think at the core of this view of, anybody can change the world is a world that's really malleable, which is something that we
Yeah.
found with designers and a lot of the creative people we talk to. They just describe a world that feels full of possibilities and full of opportunities for change, big and small. It's not a static world.
Absolutely. And I think it's also possibly got something, I would like to know what you think about this, but it might have something to do with the sort of Eastern philosophies as I understand them. The idea that water flows easily where it wants to go. Quite often, the problems in the world, I suspect, are rather like that water. And the dam that's holding them back appears to be impregnable, but actually everyone really wants it to be removed. We just haven't quite worked out how. So it's very much a design thing. We just need someone to come in and say, what if you do this thing? And everything can flow forward much more smoothly.
Yeah, that's a core Taoist concept of the water that wants to
Yes.
flow everywhere.
And I think that's what we want to do.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. There's this sort of a force for removing the friction and removing the blockages, and sooner or later that does give way. It may take a lot longer if we don't actually find a clever way of doing it.
There's so many of these funny little ways of thinking. Another thing that comes up a lot is the jujitsu principle, where you don't try to push, you just allow it to come towards you and fall over. Again and again, this takes me back to one of the principles in theatrical improvisation, which I think is really helpful, which is the idea of accepting and adding rather than blocking. I'm sure you've come across this idea. One of the first things anyone ever learns about improv is that you say yes and to everything. That's not true. You don't say yes and to everything. But as a working principle, it's useful to notice how much negativity arises when someone, whether using the word no or not, says no. And how much of an impediment that creates, and how less playful and how less creative it becomes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you went and actually trained at theater improv, with one of the original founding fathers. Yeah, tell me
Yes.
about that experience. And what's the value that you found there?
I mentioned a moment ago, I think, that I learned about this idea of power as being something that you can think about as a powerful king on stage. So I was already thinking in terms of the stage and the theatre as a metaphor for the wider world, but also because of the idea of action and human motivation and how do we start. So when I was trying to write this book, How to Change the World, and I was thinking, how do you do that? How do you do that? Why would anyone change the world? Why would anyone set out to change the world? What happens? How does it work? Because I don't think you change anything out there until something changes in here, in you first. And we can't just click our fingers and change something in ourselves. I couldn't see how that could be the case. Like, why would we even want to? We're happy with how we are at the moment, thank you very much. Or if we're not happy, we don't think that we can change it, because that's why we're in a pickle. So I was really struggling with, how do we find that? And then it just dawned on me, of course, actors find all sorts of different parts of themselves and allow themselves to be with, or to embody, or to enact those parts of themselves that most of us in ordinary life don't ever get to play around with. And so I thought I'd look into that. I read some very boring books about acting, and then I read one that was really interesting, and it was called Impro, and it was by Keith Johnston. And I thought this is going to be a great story for a magazine. I had great fun training with him in short periods, but over a period of a number of years, doing lots of different things and finding little bits of myself. And also, I think most importantly for your audience, seeing that there is a kind of a framework and a scaffolding that allows you to think about how to approach the not knowing. How are the ways of preparing oneself to go on stage without a clue what's going to happen? And what from that can I apply to non-performers in everyday life? Because we are all improvising from one minute to the next. And actually, it then also toppled over into having a massive effect on my spiritual life.
Before we go there, tell me about the rejection game.
Oh, Yeah, great.
Yeah.
The rejection game was 4 people on stage, and one of them must be socially rejected by the other 3. And as the rules of the game were described to us, that means that either that one person is sent off the stage, or the other 3 people leave that one person on stage, or they just completely act as if that person's a ghost, totally ignore them. And it sounds like, ooh, that's exciting, but also terrifying. Like, oh no. And it mustn't be you. That's the point. So one of those 4 people, but it mustn't be you. So it mustn't be everyone. We all think it must be us. So then we would go on stage, and at first it's really nerve-wracking because it feels like a small kind of death to be socially cut off in front of an audience. That's like, oh man, I am the scapegoat. I am the hated, the shameful, the outside person. So it feels really high stakes, even though it's very playful. And one thing that we learned very quickly was that being unpleasant is not a good tactic. So don't be nasty to someone in the hope that person will be rejected because you look nasty. So that's a huge life lesson right there. Being nasty to people makes you look nasty. Okay, right, that's one thing. So you all become really charming, and yet you still have to reject someone. So you become really charming to 2 people and hope that those 2 people also become charming in that little 3, and then the 4th person sort of withers away. That's a technique that seems to develop. And what that really means is that you learn so quickly the importance of eye contact and physical space. So if you imagine 4 people on stage and one of them is far away from the other 3, that person is in serious danger. So we quickly learned about spatial things like that. Anyway, I did get very excited about the game because I thought it had so much potential for being a metaphor for how the world operates. I mean, right now, Russia is really playing a game of the rejection game, and it's not winning right now. So I was really curious about that. So then I wanted to go and play the game in Northern Ireland with a mixed community which I did, of people who are from the variety of different backgrounds in Northern Ireland. And I wanted to see what would happen if you, for example, had 2 people from one part of the community and 2 people from another part of the community. Someone's going to have to make an alliance across the divide in order to reject someone else. How's that going to work? Fascinating. Brilliant fun to play that game.
Yeah. You mentioned that improv really helped you approach life differently, approach uncertainty differently. Did it have any effect on your public speaking? What was the biggest takeaways from improv?
It definitely had a big effect on my public speaking. And I was also becoming increasingly aware through improv that I would be okay if I didn't know what was going to happen. By background, I'm a writer and someone who wants to structure things and tell a story and tell it well and to have a bit of a plan. But I became increasingly delighted with the idea that I was really meeting people where they are if I'm not too stuck with the plan. If I'm not just saying, here is the script, I'm going to read it to you or memorize it and take it or leave it. I'm going to customize it to you people. Because this is, again, it's quite emblematic of this idea that we can change the world. I think you change the world if you're a member of the audience by how you are a member of the audience. If you fold your arms and fall asleep, that has an effect. If you get up and shout at or if you, like Will Smith, you come and slap the person who's speaking. Audience members aren't invisible nothings. They have an effect. So I wondered about how to enlist that and how to play with it. So sometimes when I was doing talks about how to change the world, I would ask people to write down on a piece of paper a way that they want to change the world. And then I'd just go and collect them all from the audience. That felt like a way of quite improvisationally enlisting them to think about what they want to do. And because they wrote it down, it felt really important to them. And I was keeping it. And I told them, you may never see me again, but I've got this thing. I know what you want. So I was like the keeper of their wishes. So that was quite exciting. And then I had a breakdown in 2017, and it was just really difficult. And I think for me, the flavor of my breakdown had something of the quality of, I must be even more of a loser and an idiot because I wrote a book called How to Change the World. How could I not control everything and make everything work? I couldn't. I hit all sorts of difficulties that were out of my control because I'm human, as we all do. But my internal narrative was, I'm the guy who they keep on asking to come and do this talk about how to change the world. I can't possibly be so hopeless as to have things go wrong that I can't control. And so I went through this phase of being really embarrassed and uncomfortable about having ever written a book with such a grandiose title, How to Change the World, Who Do I Think I Am? Now I've come through that, and I see the value of the book, mostly because people tell me that they have found value in it, and that's kind of undeniable. That's their reality. But the thing was, I had a breakdown, went into psychiatric hospital, talked to people in groups and therapists and so on about some of the things that were troubling me, and just the fact of talking about them helped to change my world. So talking about the unspeakable, what I had felt I couldn't speak about, that was a way of changing my world. The way in which we describe our world and the way in which we find a place to be allowed to talk about those things and to be heard, that made me well. That helped to make me well.
Yeah. One of the things that you talked about is getting involved with religions, and not just one religion, but actually experiencing what different religions had to offer. I would love to hear about that part of the journey.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I really welcome that invitation. It's not one that one is often presented with. I wasn't brought up in any religious tradition, broadly speaking, a kind of background noise of faint, vague Christianity, but nothing in my immediate family. And one of the early magazine stories I did for the Financial Times magazine, I was talking to my editor about this, and he said, well, if your soul is up for sale, why don't you see which church appeals to you? It was sort of another jokey lunchtime conversation. So I spent 6 months going to different Christian denominations. I started with just Christianity. And I went most weekends, or most Sundays, and I tried really a lot of different ones. I tried them in town, I tried them in the country, I tried them in England, I tried them in Scotland. I tried high church and low church, and joining in, and Pentecostal, revivalist, and very serious liturgical Catholicism. I just really tried to be taken by it. I very quickly realized I couldn't do it while turning up with a notebook. That's like wearing a suit of armor. So I had to just go in unguarded, like an ordinary person who might just turn up. And I found so much of it really interesting and appealing, and I liked the people. But at the time, this is 20 years ago, I just couldn't overcome the intellectualizing of the propositions, which were propositions that I was putting in the way as obstacles. No one else needed to put them in the way. So I thought I had to understand what God was, which now to me seems like clearly, if I think I understand what it is, that's not God. That's my current take on it. But I thought if I could only understand it, then I could join in with these nice people. But I couldn't. So anyway, then jump forward a few years. I clearly had an interest in this because these were all my ideas. I then decided to practice living as much as I could, like a Muslim for a month. And I had Muslim friends who would take me into the mosque and who would pray with me and who would help me fasting. And I really liked lots of things about it. The thing I particularly liked about that particular religion and that experimental experience was the sense of brotherhood. I mean, I'm a man, I guess sisterhood too, but the idea that at the same time, everywhere, everyone was facing the same direction, and we were all doing the same thing. I also particularly like the humility which is embodied. This is like yoga in a way, but also not yoga. I don't want to disrespect it. But when you're on your knees and your nose is on the ground, there's a real humility there. You can't do that and be proud. It just physically doesn't work. So there's something very brilliant about the physicality of it. I also have a lot of Jewish friends and relatives, so I've done a lot of Seders and a lot of Friday nights. And, I can say the Friday night prayers in Hebrew. I've never really formally learned them, but I can say them. And so I also have that. I have, from studying English literature, a very strong sense of biblical stories and narrative. And I still couldn't quite, I wasn't really grabbed, but I don't know why Christianity, Judaism and Islam didn't quite work. So I settled on Buddhism because it seemed to me inoffensive. I mean, great, but also no one's going to take exception to this and I don't have to believe in God. Basically, just like saying I go to yoga classes. No one's going to mind that, except some really quite unusual people. So it was easy and fine to read and to love reading things about Buddhism and to use the practices and to learn about meditation techniques and to learn different Buddhist traditions. I really, really liked it. But then I had a breakdown. Nothing to do with the Buddhism, but I had a breakdown. And around about that point, I started to feel just incredibly looked after. And I couldn't quite tell you how that crept up on me. I can't put my finger on it. It was an incidental, incremental, very granular process. But I felt that certain people were there for me just when I needed it. And it was kind of a mini miracle. And I was definitely being looked after, and I couldn't quite understand that. And then I was advised that when I go to see my therapist, I should spend time afterwards just letting it all sink in, because he gets like double the value rather than rushing home and getting on with something. And my therapist just happened to be right next door to one of the most beautiful churches in London. And it's cheap going into a church. You don't have to buy a coffee. And I wasn't earning anything at that time. So I just went into the church and I just sat there. And it was really beautiful. It was partly designed by William Morris. And I just thought, this is a really lovely place. And I'd watch people coming in and praying, and I had no idea really what they were doing. Didn't know how they did it, but they just have kneeled in front of things and lit candles. And I thought, that looks nice. So I'm going to do that. And then I started reading more, and I just felt more and more like I am looked after. And I'm very hesitant to say any of this because I'm not used to saying any of this, but I decided that I believe, and I don't know what that means, and I don't have any certainty about it. But what I really do like is the sense that even just by giving it a name that stands for something that I don't know or understand, I have a focus for my thanks. I really struggled when I was trying to enact and work on Buddhism. I couldn't understand, how can I be grateful if there's no one to be grateful to? For me, that was a problem. I can see that other people don't have that problem. But if I can say thank you, God, that kind of feels like a love letter written to someone as opposed to no one. And so for me, that's how I ended up feeling like I need to be okay with just allowing myself to be a person who believes.
There's a book by a Zen master and author, American, that I follow, Brad Warner, which the title is "There Is No God and He's Always With You," which I love.
I love that.
And I think what he's trying to get towards a Buddhist conception or Zen conception of God. It's not exactly right to call Buddhism an atheistic religion, because especially in Zen, in some of the Mahayana and Vajrayana, there is a concept of God. But it's a beautiful process of finding the thing that supports you. Also connect with the need to integrate after therapy. I used to do therapy, and what I found was I always had the breakthroughs meditating the morning after. Then that was when something clicked. It wasn't in the session. It was the day after.
It also comes back to, there is a connection with impro, because Keith used to, when we were just starting out, he would say, okay, go on stage and do something. And like, what? I don't know. What? That's so discombobulating. So he'd say, okay, let's just give it some shape. Go and do something with your hand and then decide what it is. And he writes about this in his book. So someone would go on stage and then they might go like this. And I'm now raising my hand. And he'd say, okay, what are you doing? And they would pause and they would say, I'm standing on the tube train, on the underground train, on the metro. And he'd say, that wasn't your first thought, was it? And they'd say, no, it wasn't. And he'd say, what was your first thought? And they said, I'm milking a giraffe. And he'd say, that was a better idea. And so we had this kind of experience. We'd be talking about this kind of thing. And it's a lovely story, that, about milking a giraffe. So the original idea was this wonderful, brilliantly creative, beautiful thing that people are too ashamed of saying because it's too bonkers. So this is why they censored themselves and said the boring thing instead. But then Keith said, and one of the things that he gave us was to not try to be responsible for what comes into our head. He said, you might as well say that God put it there, because then it's not your fault. And you just say it. And I really took that on board. It was such a liberating thought. I wasn't going to churches or anything at the time, but I thought, yeah, God put that idea in my head. I love that idea. So It's none of my business. I'm not clever. I didn't decide to do this. It just happened. I really don't know where ideas come from. I have no idea where ideas come from. So if God is a sort of catch-all term for some mysterious force, that'll do.
That's such a lovely story. And so we have this ending question, this final question that I always ask, but it's funny because you actually know, Alain. So the question goes like this. In his TED Talk, philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. You know, a lecture being really dry and factual, and you make up your own mind, and a sermon being a more urgent plea to change someone's life for the better. And so if you could give a short sermon today, and it doesn't have to be something you necessarily believe tomorrow or yesterday, but today, what would your sermon be?
Maybe my sermon would be, this would be today because I've just spent this time talking to you. So this is addressing something that has been openly and in the background part of our conversation. After having the difficulties that I had and being so weighed down by the idea of having written a book on how to change the world, I wrote a piece for Medium, the website. They sometimes pay journalists to write something. So I wrote something for them on why you don't have to save the world. Now, I use the word save, not change. It's not your responsibility to save the world. And my sermon would be, because I do believe that we can all change the world. We all have an impact on the world. And all the things that I've said, I do believe all of those things. But I also think there's room in this world for a sermon about how fundamentally powerless we are on so many things, and for embracing that and accepting it and even being grateful for it. We're not in charge. We're part of this. None of us individually is all powerful. And to know the distinction between what we can control and what we can't is such a powerful bit of wisdom.
Yeah, that's a lovely final sermon. So I wanted to thank you very much for your time today and for your insights.
Thank you very much for a really warm space to have a conversation. And thank also you, listening person, for your time, because you, if you're listening to this bit, have been listening for a certain amount of time. So thank you very much.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well everyone, and see you next week on Remake.